Great. So my name is Ross Yelsey. I'm an assistant director of admission and marketing here at Columbia Journalism School. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in today, this Friday, to learn more about the Master of Arts Business and Economics concentration, a really great program for experienced journalists to take their work to the next level when it comes to financial and economic reporting. I'd like to welcome Professor Winnie O'Kelly, who directs the MA Business program, as well as a 2021 grad of the program, David Hollerith, and they will talk with us now about the program, the student experience, the kind of things you'll learn throughout the program. And I think to start, just to introduce our faculty to this audience who might not know kind of all the great people who work at the school, Winnie, would you want to tell the group a bit about your own background in journalism and also what kind of led you into teaching?
Yeah, sure. First, nice to have you all here. I'm very excited about this program. It's always a joy to see some prospective new students. I have a great group this year, so my heart is in making sure that we have some other great students coming in this coming year. I spent a long time as a business journalist primarily. Most of my career, the bulk of it was spent at the New York Times, and 2 decades where I was mostly running financial coverage and economics coverage for them, although I did some other stints running national desk news coverage and enterprise stories and doing some investigative work. But primarily business and financial journalist. I kind of fell into it, to be perfectly honest, and I loved the intellectual challenge of it. Really exciting. And in my time there, and along with running economics coverage in general, I got the pleasure of covering some really difficult stories. One was 9/11, and as Wall Street got back on its feet and tried to get markets opening again. One was the financial crisis before our great recession here. We had a financial crisis that was overwhelming. And that was around the 2008 mortgage meltdown in this country. And that was an extraordinary experience. I like the fast paced adrenaline of a newsroom, but I like combining it with sort of longer term work. So for me, it was always a pleasure to be in a newsroom like that. Um, I did the same thing. In fact, when I went to Bloomberg News for 7 years, where I was an executive editor, I was often running a lot of big stories and also working on long enterprise stories that we were hoping would be, prize candidates and making a difference kind of journalism. So I love it all. And I try to equip my students to have that sort of well-rounded experience. I always say, I'm a little bit of a nerd in some ways because I like the hard stuff. I love a good fun story too, but the kind of hard stories that I did were often when Enron was on the verge of collapse. People were like, "Ooh, there's an accounting thing here," and I'm like, "I'll do it. That sounds good." And so Arthur Andersen's collapse and Enron was something that I, gave a year of my life to almost. Same thing with taxes, which I thought corporate taxes were a really complex issue that deserved more treatment. Got to spend a long time working on a series with that with one of my favorite reporters at the Times, and he won a Pulitzer for that. So that's the pleasure of the job. I'd like to give students an opportunity to understand how they can do all those kinds of stories, from news to analysis to features, and cover the biggest stories of the day and do that first draft of history that we love to talk about. And with business journalism, I think it's super important because there isn't really anybody else to hold them accountable. There's prosecutors for wrongdoing sometimes, but they often need a roadmap, and regulators are overmatched. So I think what we do in this space is super important, to be sort of a watchdog on capitalism.
Great. And it kind of leads us to the next question about this particular program. I know a lot of potential applicants are probably looking at our website, looking at the MS program, the MA program, looking at the different concentrations. And so to give people a better sense of this program, can you talk a bit more about its purpose and why it's been important to have a specific concentration in this area of journalism to give this more advanced training to people?
Yeah, so all my answers kind of blur, right? But the truth is, if you're going to take on those really difficult, knotty stories, you're going to need to be equipped with certain information and certain abilities, and you build them over time for sure. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think the MA can equip you to take on some of those more difficult things. Even, David was mentioning about covering an earnings story recently. I got to tell you, bank earnings are not a simple thing. They're pretty complex, and you want to be able to approach those with a good eye, a jaundiced eye, but also an educated one. And if you want to try to take on bigger stories behind the scenes or more complex ones and investigations, you're also going to want to be able to understand a little bit, like, how does accounting work? The executive tells me this. Is that right? Should I believe it? Is there a gray area? And so getting that confidence is a big part of, I think, what you can get out of the MA program. And the other thing I always like to throw in, because I think this is super important, and again, this comes from my own personal experience. When I was at the Times, the executive editor for much of that time period was Joe Lelyveld. And he insisted that anybody who wanted to go abroad as a correspondent had to spend some time in BizDay and start to understand how money works and how the economy works. And I would say that it became an essential spot for anybody with bigger ambitions. So people who went on to cover governors and took down governors in education, or went to cover China, they spent time understanding the plumbing as well as all of the actors in the economy. And I think that was for everybody's best interest.
Great. And so turning it over to David. David, do you want to tell us a bit about your journey here? What were you doing before you came to Columbia, and what made you decide that the MA Business and Economics concentration was the right program to apply to?
Sure, yeah. So I was working for a startup. It was a sort of like a tech startup. It had a media component and some other things. And it was focused on the cryptocurrency space. So I was actually learning a lot at the time. And I was learning on the job in terms of what the material was. It was kind of a mix of computer science and economics and kind of some other things too. And, a lot of it was kind of predicated on this idea about sort of the existing system of banking and economics. And, I didn't understand that. So I studied English in college. So I didn't really have a background in that. And so I was suddenly extremely curious to learn more. And also at the same time, the company I was working for, they were a little bit more pivoted, I guess you would say, to they wanted more cheerleading as opposed to journalism. So I hadn't really written for a newspaper in college, although I had done a lot of writing. I was kind of discovering the difference between journalism and other things. And, I just reached a point where I wanted to see what journalism was really about. And so I started kind of exploring, programs, and I think it came down to figuring out what fit for me, and also sort of what I was wanted to do with my career. And I think that the MA program, what really led me to that was the combination you're juggling in terms of the business classes that have been mentioned on the one side, and then also storytelling and journalism. So all different components. But I thought the blend was really cool. And I applied to 3 schools and got into all of them, but this was the program that really only had that.
Great. And Winnie, we talked about David's story about getting here. Could you tell people a bit about what we look for, in an applicant to this particular program, which does look for people with some experience in journalism to be, a good candidate, since it does presume people will have some essential reporting skills?
Exactly. I mean, we want someone who understands like how to go out and report a story on some level. That means what's fair and what's balanced, and how you gather information, and maybe how you construct a basic story. I get a decent number of students who maybe come from general journalism background. I think this is something that will give them a leg up, or maybe they've started to develop a passion for it. So that's one group, which is great. And you can't really pigeonhole everybody. I also get some students who have been doing something else, working as maybe consultants or in industry a bit, but always had a passion for journalism. Maybe they did it in college, and really want to make that transition, and realize it's very hard to make that transition. So we can give them some hands-on experience. I've had people who worked for like consulting firms, and Price Waterhouse or a Gartner Group or that kind of stuff. And they're pretty good writers. They don't know as much about reporting. So I kind of wanted to make that exception, because there are some who fall into that category, and they've done quite well. But generally speaking, you don't have to have a business background. Some people will. I remember David coming in with like crypto experience and thinking, this is interesting. So there will be some. I'll get a decent number of students who have spent quite a few years, maybe 5 or 7 years abroad, covering maybe like the tech industry where they're from or something like that. But they felt like they didn't have that breadth of experience to understand how to tackle bigger stories or bigger issues. And they come here to get that. So I get a pretty wide range of experience. It's a small seminar, so I think we can accommodate that pretty well. We can work with people who need like a little bit more on the basics, or maybe people who have a great business sense and a little less journalism. And I actually think that's the beauty of the class, is the students learn from each other as well, and they kind of lift each other up.
Great. And for the students who do come here, they'll have a core seminar in this concentration, business and economics, in both the fall and the spring semesters that meets usually, like, what is it, 3 hours twice a week, so about 6 hours a week together with this group. What are some of the things that they learn over the course of that seminar, and how is it kind of designed in terms of building skills or getting types of exposure to aspects of the beat?
So I'm right in the thick of the fall seminar right now, so I'll talk probably more about it just because it's deeply in my brain at the moment. We really start with the macro view of the economy. So typically we start off trying to understand how you gauge living standards around the world and what makes a difference in those. So to understand the underpinnings of economies, businesses, governments, consumers, what feedback loops are in there. And then we try to break it down to cover all the basics. So from there, we've looked at like an economy that's failing, like Venezuela, once very prosperous, but is failing now. What happened, how it got there, what it means. We try to take apart the labor market so that you can understand what's going on in jobs. We'll look at fiscal policy. What's the government do? What's its role in the economy? We'll take on some of the biggest topics of the day, like inequality, what can be done? How do we understand it? It's a popular beat now in a number of publications. I want people to know how you think about covering it. And we run through from there to pretty much everything you'd want. So you're going to learn how the Fed works, you're going to learn how the government works, you're going to understand tax policy, you're going to think about what consumers do. How do they shop? How do they buy? What do they save? What do they do for retirement? How do they buy houses? Businesses kind of the same way all the way through. So everything from like some pretty basics to some of my favorite subjects, like the financial shenanigans that companies do, and crony capitalism, where that can take us, and how you can find that information, really, how you can take it apart and become a reporter to get to the bottom of something, who you can trust as sources, how you can get there. And in the spring, it kind of builds on that with a more of a micro view. So understanding how industries work, how the markets work, how you look at income sheets and balance statements, how you would cover an industry, and how you would do like a much more in-depth piece.
Great. And I know we'll talk about the master's thesis a little later, but in the seminar too, students are doing, different types of reporting stories over the course of the 2 semesters. Can you talk a little bit about how students are kind of able to improve their reporting and storytelling through the feedback they get on the assignments you give?
Sure, and maybe I'll ask David to say, because he can tell the truth, right? I want students to learn how to come up with ideas, because that's a big part of what you do. Certainly as a journalist, you're going to have to go out and cover certain events and certain things that happen. But what we're really trying to do here is build other muscles so that you can find ideas, figure out how to pitch that story, and then execute it. So typically I have students come up with pitches most every week on the topics we're on, and then they'll write one of every other week. They'll turn one of those into a true story of a modest size that will help them understand the basic foundations. And I will try to give pretty serious feedback. I spent many decades as an editor, and I'm used to taking stories apart and giving lots and lots of feedback. So David, you tell me, does it work?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I think the feedback is learning how to work with feedback and get it it's pretty essential to having a job in journalism and knowing how to work with your editor and or boss. And so, like, when you do that in the M&A seminar, you're essentially practicing that, and you're practicing just how that relationship works. And as much as it really, the specific feedback really did help, it was more so just figuring out how to do it and work with people. Because if you pursue a career in journalism, it's something that you repeat on a daily basis. And, it just takes a little bit of a finesse and practice in terms of figuring out how to do it. But that being said, Professor O'Kelly, or Winnie, has been, she was an amazing editor in her time. And, she did a really good job of sort of making you think through a story by explaining it out loud, which is actually it's a really good way to do it, and it's usually how any story I don't write gets sort of thrown away or scrapped, is talking through the ideas and things like that. So yeah.
Great, thanks, David. And maybe you could expand on some of the other things that stood out for you as you look back at the MA program in terms of, were there certain subjects that were really interesting, certain topics or assignments that really stand out as you look back as being really interesting, really rewarding for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've got to say, just like the relationships you build are sort of the core part of it. But to the actual seminar, I would say, the lecturers are, they're the top people in their fields. And it was, some of that was a little bit lost on me at the time, just because you're being introduced to all these people you've never met before. But in some cases, like our first lecturer was Torsten Slok, who is a chief economist at Apollo. And, in my newsroom that I work at, he's essentially, his emails, when he sends out something about the economy, is what everybody looks at. We had other people we had someone who also, was sort of holding power to Trump while he was in office, and was able to talk to us about that experience. And then two actual speakers during different parts of the year who ended up working in the Biden administration's antitrust policy. So, the speakers are incredible, to the point where, like, being able to understand their thinking in an environment where, you're just learning, it's kind of incredible. And you're not going to necessarily have that kind of opportunity another way. But, I think the seminar in general, going back to the feedback point, working through stories and collaborating with students in the program, and working with the professor, I think was kind of the number one thing. Because I mean, at the end of the day, it's putting all those pieces together that sort of allows you to kind of be able to tell these stories in a quick way, which is sort of what you would do if you pursued the career in journalism. And it's been essential to me. So.
Great. And Winnie, David was talking about these great, people who will talk to the class and give lectures or conversations with them. Can you talk a bit about how you kind of choose who to invite, and kind of the strategy behind that, of whether it's journalists or business people or people in academia? Like, what kinds of things do you want people to get better depth of understanding from these people that come in?
Yeah, I try to push pretty hard on the business people and economist side, because as David says, you might not get access to those in your everyday life just easily off the street. And journalists, I have some of those come in too, who can take apart a story, describe how they did something. But I lean heavily on the other, because I think it's practice. It gives you a chance to ask questions just like you would if you were working on a story. You can read some of their work in advance. You can think about what's going on in the economy. We usually look at what's happening with the unemployment, and then we'll have Torsten come in, and people can ask him questions and say, "What do you think's happening here? Is inflation under control or not?" And he will answer your questions point on the record and go for it. So you can get as much out of that as experience as you're prepared for. So I tend to lean in that direction. Students have heard from, as David was saying, I forgot Lena Khan, who is now the head of the FTC, was in and talked about antitrust with us. Stiglitz was in last spring doing something. Joe Stiglitz, who's a Nobel Prize winner. So the list goes on, but I'm also really happy about some other kinds of people we bring in. Like, honestly, someone who's an analyst who does a really intensive job of taking apart industry and companies, so that students can get a feel for what that's like, how those people can be helpful to them in their own work, and where to cast doubt about what they're doing. That kind of learning how to work with experts and incorporate it in your work to get what you can from it, but to not fall prey to easy answers or someone who may have an agenda, is a big part of what we hope to get. I've had in short sellers who people love. Mark Cahotas, one of my short sellers, will come in and chat with everybody, and that's just like kind of fun and a totally different experience. Or I'll go on, and we'll have someone come in who's like Teresa Girladucci, who's kind of the world's expert on pensions, and she was in while she was advising the Pete Buttigieg campaign for presidency on what they should be doing. So we'll have a lot of people who are really involved in policy and who are thinking about it hard, and who are running businesses and analyzing businesses.
Great. And so we talked a bit about these writing, assignments that they'll be doing in the seminar throughout the time they're here. But on top of that is this master's thesis, which all MA students will be undertaking, a really ambitious work of journalism that they'll do in the fall and through the spring. Winnie, could you talk a bit about what that process is like in terms of developing that and the kinds of topics some of the former students have gotten into with their master's thesis?
Well, I'll have to say, David will have to give a minute about his because his was quite memorable too. But yeah, it's a big project. It's probably something bigger than you've ever undertaken. Certainly as a journalistic exercise, maybe you did a big something for academic work, but it's a big enterprise. It's pushing 8,000 words is where we put it at. So in order to accomplish something of that size, you have to do a massive amount of reporting, and it requires skills, organization, research, time commitment that help you build a lot of skills that you can use even for shorter stories. Several of the ones in the recent years that I thought were really fun or exciting. One of my students did a piece on Coca-Cola and its promises about the environment, and she found that it had not done what it had said it done. So she did a nice little expose. Part of that was published. Sort of took that company's promises about being very good for the environment and said, nope, they didn't actually do this. They say they have, but they haven't. And that was big, taking on a giant Fortune 500 company. Another one recently did something on the wine industry, which is also going through massive climate change and how that's having to change what it does entirely, moving to Oregon from Napa Valley and doing different grapes and how it's going to change that particular industry. A lot of them will focus on a particular company or a particular story, and having a clear character is helpful. One student did one on a startup company in the grocery delivery business. And that was really interesting as it was trying to march to an IPO, an initial public offering of stock. One of my students this year is going to do Taylor Swift Inc., which is going to be really interesting. She's going to take it apart, and she's got a great advisor who just left the Wall Street Journal, so I can say this. He was the page one editor of the Wall Street Journal. He just left. He's really wanted to do Taylor Swift before he left. He didn't get to it. And we said, oh, we have a student who wants to do that. So the two of them are going to work on Taylor Swift Inc. over the next few months. So that's the kind of thing we do. But David, you should just say something quickly about yours because yours was great.
Yeah, so at the time, we were kind of deep in the pandemic, and so interest rates were really low, and a lot of people were at home, and so a lot of people had gotten into stock trading, and I kind of focused on GameStop, which is obviously this video game retailer, which had fallen on tough times, and retail traders had sort of sent the price up a lot. And there's this whole investment situation that was going on there. And it had a mix of a little bit of politics, a lot of markets, and kind of just said something about sort of what was going on in the US at the time during the pandemic. And so I went after that. And, it was kind of a marathon to go through the thesis. And you get to explore a lot of different things you would normally be able to. Like one great example is you actually get to travel if you have the option to go somewhere and actually get a scene, if that makes sense. A lot of times for a normal daily story or something like that, you won't have that kind of experience or time to do it, and it makes the difference. And I think at the end of the day, really what this does is it allows you to work on something that's more complex than a basic daily news story, which is like that's kind of a whole wheelhouse. And I would say the whole program kind of helps with this too, but it allows you to sort of write at a higher level report at a higher level that a lot of people don't really understand because then they're really been given the space or time to do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And of course, you're not doing it totally on your own. You have this advisor. How does that person kind of help you kind of throughout the process, kind of refine your story in the initial stages and then also, make the final draft as good as it can be?
Oh, sorry. The question is for Winnie. Yeah, so the advisor is like a crucial part of it, given that, you're doing a lot of this for the first time. And so they're like an essential person to work with and see on a weekly basis. And you know, I think the best part of it is that you get to build a relationship with them. And so you get to, you know, constantly pick their brain about how they would approach a problem. And it helps you kind of build on your own thinking. So I mean, I can't underline enough how crucial it is to be working and communicating with your advisor through that process.
Great. And so we talked a lot about all the journalistic things that are going on in the program in terms of being in Pulitzer Hall for the seminar, doing the master's thesis with advisors who are connected to the school. But in addition to the things you're doing in journalism school, there'll be 3 outside courses in other areas of the university that will help you kind of understand your beat better. For MA Business and Economics students, that will include 2 classes that are really like part of the curriculum, which are financial accounting, which people take in the fall, and then corporate finance they take in the spring. And then they have another class that's more up to their own choosing. Winnie and David, maybe you could tell us a bit about why it's important that all of our students graduate with knowledge about those 2 areas, specifically financial accounting and corporate finance.
Yeah, as you said, those are just foundational areas. I will tell you that if you ever try to do any kind of reporting around a company that kind of goes in deep, having that skill set and having that understanding it really gets you there. I mean, I've certainly been across the table from top CEOs surrounded by their lawyers and their accountants telling me I'm wrong. And you can't go into that unless you've got some confidence and some ability to understand what they're talking about. And that's really a skill you want to build on. So that's part of it. And I've had the pleasure of working on an awful lot of investigations of companies in which they had to restate their earnings, or companies that went belly up. And you don't want to undertake that lightly. You have to remember there's a lot at stake. There are individuals who work for those companies, there's CEOs, there's investors. You know, you don't want to make mistakes. You want to actually be able to delve into it. So that's part of it. And then I'll tell you just another little story about it very quickly. I just saw a former student last week at an award ceremony here. She came into the program with a good bit of experience. She'd worked on the Panama Papers and investigation. She had a lot going for her. She left the program and she took accounting and corporate finance, and she said, "Oh, that'll really help me, you know, write about these companies." She went to a place where they had some layoffs, and when they had layoffs, they went around to her unit and they said, "You know, you're the only unit that's coming in under budget. Could you work with the rest of our newsroom on that?" So she's now essentially running the newsroom because of her skills. And she said, "I had no idea. I thought I was learning accounting and corporate finance to use it just for journalism, and I'm still doing that, but I'm also using it now in my day-to-day life as trying to manage our newsroom." And she told me about the things they didn't have in place, and she was laughing because they didn't even have this and that and the other thing. So you'll be surprised at how useful it is throughout your life.
Great. And David, oh, sorry. Yeah, you mentioned you were an English major in college. What was it like kind of diving into these subject areas at Columbia?
Yeah, just to add to that, yeah, I mean, the accounting and corporate finance courses were really tough. But, you know, I think with your classmates, you know, everybody, depending on the skill set and level, can kind of work out, you know, a way to get through it. And you know, these classes are, you know, I was thinking about it yesterday, actually, and the way this plays into like a future career, if you are writing stories, is that, you know, you can essentially write more original stories, because if you can learn how to interpret numbers, you can also manipulate them in a way by, you know, like a lot of my stories are really just taking 2 numbers and adding them together. And sometimes it's just that those 2 numbers are in two places that people don't really look, and, you know, you're taught about where to look. So in these courses, so that's a really simple way to explain it. And these courses are very tough. They were for me, but it kind of gives you again this other skill set that a lot of people don't have. And you know, that's not even just business; it's just as applicable to anywhere where money is involved.
Mhm. Great. So this has been a great conversation about the kind of the 9 months students will spend at Columbia in this program. And I think the question some people might have is what's after that? Winnie, could you talk a bit about what some of the career paths of our graduates have been that come out of this program?
Yeah, they're as varied as you can imagine. I will say this up front. There is a really robust demand for business journalists. I know that it's a difficult field right now. I know journalism is undergoing a lot. The careers people often say to me, I wish we had twice as many of your students because I have so many people wanting to hire them. So that's really the truth. They land everywhere. It's, as I said, I come in with students with very different experiences coming in. So the level of experience they have going out is going to dictate different kinds of futures for them immediately after school. So I have students now working on the investigative team at Bloomberg News, for example. I have a student who's at Futuro, where she's also like kind of running the newsroom now, in addition to leading their investigative team. There are students at Dow Jones, at Reuters. I'm trying to think of, it really runs the gamut. Forbes, Fortune, I can think of so many different places. And there are people at smaller publications as well. And I really want to emphasize that because I actually think that's one of the best starting points for many people. One of my students from a couple of years ago has gone to the Connecticut Mirror, which is working to be a really important local journalist outlet. She's doing great investigations there. She did something that was really terrific through a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests and is really killing it. So that's an example. Others will work on niche publications, which sometimes they're like, I don't know if I should do this or not. I say, well, there's a really good reason to think about it because one, you can get that kind of deep experience in an area. And then when bigger publications are looking to hire somebody in real estate or in tech, you've got a few years of experience doing that. So places like The Real Deal or Insider, those kinds of publications are also popular with our graduates. And I encourage them to think long and hard about taking those opportunities when they arise.
Great. And David, can you tell us a bit about what you have been doing since you graduated from Columbia and maybe what skills and things you learned from the program have been valuable in what you are doing now?
Yeah, so I've ever since I graduated, I've worked for Yahoo Finance, and I'm a senior reporter, and I also will go on air on occasion to talk about my stories on the live show. And so I came in and I started covering cryptocurrency. It was an area that I had known. And then also from there, I've started covering banking around March. And, I would say that just the tools that have been essential to me is, I can't emphasize getting the accounting and corporate finance background. And then also I would say the kind of writing you get to do. And the way you get to learn how to use storytelling and journalism together in a way that works. I would say both those things I'm using every day, especially today while I sort of try to file my weekend feature story. But I would just say altogether, it's been pretty essential experience for me. So.
Great, that's terrific. So now is the chance for people who have some questions to put them into the chat. Direct them to me, the host, Ross, and I can raise as many as are applicable for this particular conversation about this program. But before we get to those as they get typed in, Winnie, maybe you could tell this group a bit about, if they're thinking of applying, what you look for in a strong application to this type of program.
Yeah, I would say motivation is one of the things we're always most interested in. Yes, you can look at your credentials and your background, that'll be on your application. But what we really want to see is people who really have a commitment and a desire to go out and do excellent journalism. So that's the number one thing we're always looking for. So if it's something that speaks to you, tell us why. What is it about it? That's something we're looking for. I don't want to scare anyone away, but as David said, the corporate finance and accounting courses are tough. So we are looking for someone who has a real comfort and who's done well in academia, because we don't want anyone to come in the program and really struggle. It's going to be hard, but it'll get you through. So we want to make sure you've got the background. We assume you all could do it, but we want to make sure you've got the background. Keep in mind, this is graduate level accounting and corporate finance. It's not undergrad level. So we want to make sure you're comfortable with quantitative material in some fashion, right? That's just something we'd like to hear from you and like to see you address. And again, I said I tend to see people in two general kind of categories. Those are people who maybe don't have a lot of experience, but a little bit. Maybe it was the college paper. Maybe they took a detour for a little while and did something a little bit different. I have had some people who've done more corporate work and said, I really want to get back to journalism. I can tell that's where my heart is. And before it's too late, I want to make that transition. And it's just too hard to do without getting a leg up. So they'll come here and we'll get them that leg up so that they can, relaunch themselves into a different direction. And others are journalists. They may have, 5, 10, 15 years of experience, even sometimes abroad or domestically, who are like, I think I'm ready for that next rung up. And the best way to get there is to come in and to deepen my skill set and experience in this area. So those are the kind of things we're kind of looking for. Like, can you write? Are you motivated? Tell us why and what speaks to you. And if you've got like an unconventional background for some reason, don't count yourself out. Just tell us why and let us understand what works for you.
Yeah, that's great advice. So I see a question in the chat here about kind of someone wondering about the general size of this program year to year, like what kind of average size might they expect to have for a MA business cohort?
Yeah, anywhere between 6 to 12 students is typical. It's a small seminar, so the beauty of that is you get a lot of one-on-one time and attention. I have a group of students this year who are particularly eager for feedback. They kind of just pop in my office and say, "Here, look at this," and they've like written their pitch for their story, and they want to talk about it and see how to make it better. And we spend time doing that in addition to all of our class time. So you get a lot of me. But you also get a lot of others in the program too. So it's small, it's intimate. Speakers come in, and again, they're like having a conversation with you. This is not a lecture series at all.
Great. And a question more about what the kind of student experience is generally like. I guess it's a good question for David. I know one thing we didn't talk about is that within the journalism school, the grading is pass fail. So there's not like a lot of competition over marks here. How does that impact kind of how you approach the program and how your classmates kind of work together?
Yeah, I mean, I never had any sense of like a competition other than sort of maybe a healthy, like, oh, I want to have the best story for the class or something like that. But there's no sort of rating scale that way. So I would say in general, it's about collaboration and learning from people who have different backgrounds from you. And I mean, I think that was another thing that was really huge for me during my program is, we had a diverse cohort and we were all able to share experiences. And I think that helped us all sort of informed us in terms of, when we were working on stories together and just in general, as far as like life skills goes.
Mm-hmm. Great. And a question about investigative kind of training in the program. If people want to get into that type of storytelling, whether it's for the master's thesis or for other things, is there a way to kind of develop stronger investigative skills as an MA student?
Absolutely. It's one of my favorite things. So if it's what you want to do and you want to apply yourself, you absolutely can. I didn't really explain this because you'll find out more about it later, but generally when I have students do pitches, I give them a lot of leeway. Like if we're talking about one week about the labor market, for example, and jobs, I say, okay, come back to me with a pitch on labor. Now you'll have had some readings in it, we'll have had classes on it. So there'll be lots of ideas going through your head about what's going on in employment and what's happening with women in the workforce and what's happening with Black men. But it's totally open to you. So if a student says, hey, I've got a real interest in technology, I'm like, okay, so give me a pitch about something going on in tech. And if you do those stories all semester long, you're going to have built up some expertise in that area. Same thing for investigative. If there's areas you want to peel in investigatively, tell me what they are, and we'll work on those. And that would be a pleasure for me. And that's true for the master's thesis as well. It's really only capped by your ambitions, not by ours. There are also some additional workshops that some of my students who are really interested in investigative stuff are doing now, working with the Brown Center, which runs some interesting things on data work for those who really want to delve a little bit more deeply into that. So you can supplement it with that as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. And a question here about these guests that come and talk to the class. We talked a bit about that earlier. Someone was wondering if, you're able to adapt the syllabus when major things happen in the world, if it's financial or economic and things happening, whether it's a stock market crash or economic change, if you might be able to pivot and bring in people, to be like totally up to date with what's going on in the world of business and economics.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, that's something we aim to do. But I'll tell you, we're bringing in people who are engaged in what they're doing right now. So it's going to happen even if I didn't pivot. Like they're coming in and they're engaged in the world. That's sort of the beauty of our program. Being in New York is a huge asset. Let's not underestimate that. It is the center of business and finance and the center of journalism. So we have everyone who's working in those fields, and I'm in touch with them all the time too. And when they come in, we're having a conversation. Like Torsten and I, we have a continuing conversation every year about what's happening with the economy and what just came out and what's going on now. So it's going to be all of the moment. It's not theoretically in the background. It's very much tangibly what you can get out of it right now.
I would also just add to that Professor O'Kelly's had an uncanny good track record, at least during my year, of choosing the right speakers for the right moment. So I can't promise that every year, but I definitely remember. I'm trying to think. You had Lael Brainerd right in between her choice of moving to the Biden administration, and I just remember that being the timing of that being incredible. So it's the lecture, the speakers are incredible.
Mm-hmm. Great. And a question for David, more about, if someone in the happy instance is admitted to this program, comes to Columbia and begins it, do you have advice about how to make the most out of this program and kind of those 9 months you're here? What kind of mindset did you kind of approach the program with?
Yeah, I would say treat it like a full-time job in the best way in terms of the amount of time. It's a lot more fun than a full-time job, I would say. But take it very seriously, and obviously with anything else, it's the amount of work you put into it is the amount of work you'll get out of it. But then also, I think it's important just to highlight how important it is to interact with people and try and get involved in school in other ways too, if you can. Just because if you hang out in your room, for most of the day, every day, you're not going to really get the experience of being in New York City and being in the Upper West Side and Manhattan. And I think those were two really crucial, special parts of the program for me.
Mm-hmm. Great. I think that's a great place to end the conversation. I think that's the end of the questions we've gotten. Thank you for all the great questions here. And of course, I know people will have more questions as they kind of think about applying to Columbia for this program or for other opportunities. So I'm going to put in the chat the link to meet with our admissions team. The cool news for people who are at this session now or might be watching a recording of this soon is that the deadline to apply for the 2024-25 year for the MA Business and Economics program is January 5th. So there's still over 2 months to get your application together for this program and to ask us questions on our team about the application process, about the educational financing questions you might have. So please continue the conversation with us throughout the fall and the winter. We're happy to keep talking about it. And I think for people interested in the program too, Winnie, you're available at some points too to talk more if you have specific questions on that front.
Absolutely. I look forward to hearing from all of you.
Great. Well, thank you to Winnie. Thank you to David for this great conversation about the MA Business and Economics program. We really thank everyone for coming in and having such great questions. And we look forward to seeing you at more events in the near future. Have a great weekend. Bye now.
Thank you.
See you guys.